Normal. Para X. The views expressed and the opinions given by the individual host and their guests do not necessarily reflect those of Para X, its affiliates, or its sponsors.
Merry meet and merry part, bright the cheeks and warm the heart. For tread the circle thrice about, to keep unwelcome spirits out. Bide within the law you must, in perfect love and perfect trust. Mind the threefold laws you should, 3 times bad and 3 times good. These 8 words the read fulfill, and ye harm none, do what ye will.
Welcome to Stirring the Cauldron. Now, here's your host, Marla Brooks.
Merry meet, everybody, and welcome to Stirring the Cauldron. Now, before I give out a little bit of background about my guest tonight and the topic, I want everybody in the chat room to please answer a question. Stonehenge is one of the world's greatest mysteries. For what purpose do you think it was created, and by who? And while you're putting your thinking caps on and typing in rapidly into the chat room, let you know that my guest tonight is Graham Phillips, and he's been one of Britain's best-selling nonfiction authors for, well, over 30 years or so. In the 1990s, after working as a radio journalist and broadcaster for the BBC and editing a popular monthly magazine, he turned his talents to investigating unsolved historical mysteries. He's since written 16 books or so, and they're in print all around the world and have been published in many different languages. And tonight, we're going to be talking about his book, Wisdomkeepers of Stonehenge. Now, as you know, questions and comments are welcome from those in the chat room. And if you'd like to join us and you're listening to the live show, you can come over and find us at paraxradionetwork.com. So, Graham, I think you can step out from behind the megalith now and say hello.
Hello, yes. I'm not exactly behind megaliths, but I'm in amongst a lot of megaliths in the British Isles.
Well, yeah. I mean, there are so many, and we're going to really talk about that a little bit because a couple of things popped into my head. And the chat room hasn't answered the question yet, so let's just jump in with both feet, and then when they do, perhaps we'll have not spilled the beans before they get there. I really liked the folklore that either Stonehenge was created by Merlin, who magically transported the massive stones from Ireland, where giants had assembled them, or invading Danes that put the stones up. Another theory has it that the stones were the ruins of a Roman temple. And, of course, we also hear about the handiwork of aliens doing it. How do you think the stones got there?
Well, the Merlin legend is particularly interesting. First of all, about the Vikings and the Romans. At one point, people weren't able to date standing stones because, stones are obviously millions of years old, but at what time they were actually shaped and put in the ground was a mystery until scientists invented something called radiocarbon dating. And what that enables you to do is to date how long ago a particular organism died, be it plant or animal. So you can actually date bones with this scientific process. And the thing is that obviously stones put in the ground are not organic, so you can't use carbon dating, but you can date what's underneath them. And very often when the people who erected them put these stones in the ground, they lined the bottom of the pit with broken animal bones as a way of stopping the stone from sinking further into the soil. And there's other vegetation that's found underneath the stones. So what archaeologists do is dig under the stones and take samples and can date those. Now we know that the stones of Stonehenge, the ones we see today, are around about 5,500 years old. That's 4,500 years old, which is 2,500 BC. Now, the Vikings didn't arrive in Britain until about the 800s AD. So that is, of course, well over 2,000 years after the stones were put up. So they're not Viking. And the Romans didn't arrive until about 2,000 years ago. So they're 1,500 years too late. As for aliens, it's a nice theory. The only problem is that now it's fairly obvious how the stones were erected. It took an awful lot of work, but they were cut out. They know the quarries where various stones for stone circles, such as Stonehenge, the quarries where the stones were cut out. And they can see there that the same exactly type of rock with its particular unique formations within it match the rocks in the quarries that are the same age. And you can see quite clearly the marks where picks were used to cut out the rock. So, it's strange. They were using animal antlers for picks, and they were using the shoulder blades of oxen for shovels and flint and stone tools. So it took them a long time, but eventually they were able to do this. And obviously, if aliens were doing it with some sort of laser technology or whatever, we wouldn't find all these tool marks. So they weren't made by aliens. They were somehow dragged by humans, and it is possible to do it on rollers with enough people, and then to erect them by creating earthen or even in the winter snow ramps to put stones on top of others. But it would have taken a long time with a large part of the population to do it. So therefore, it must have been built for some very important purpose. And going back to the story of Merlin, what is interesting is it says that the legend says that Merlin brought them across from Ireland, but from far away. I said the Stonehenge we see today dates from about 2,500 BC, but that's not the original Stonehenge. The original Stonehenge was actually bigger, but consisted of a less impressive array of stones, basically just 6-foot-high stones put in a circle. I think there was 56 of them. They know this by using scientific geophysics equipment to see where the ground has been disturbed in the past. And these stones used to stand in a circle quite a bit larger than the one that's there now. And what's interesting is that those stones were then moved 500 years after they were originally put there. Again, they know this by dating vegetation samples that still exist, organic matter in where the holes were that contained the original stones. And they were eventually in 2500 BC, 500 years after originally put in this larger circle. Those stones were moved and put within a smaller circle inside the larger circle that survives today of Stonehenge. So the stones were all rearranged. What's interesting about those particular stones, which are called blue stones because they are made of a particular kind of stone that looks bluish when wet, whereas the outer stones of Stonehenge now are made from more local sarsen stone, a hard form of sandstone. These blue stones that created the original circle came all the way from South Wales. Now, that was about 130, 140 miles away to the west of Stonehenge. So they were taken from somewhere else in the direction of Ireland and brought to Stonehenge. Nobody knows why these particular stones are important, but they were moved from elsewhere to where they are now, which may have lived on in folklore to be passed on down through the generations by word of mouth to become the legend of Merlin moving the stones magically from far away to create the stone circle we know today.
I like that. How far back in history were stone circles written about? Where did that notion come up?
Well, there was no writing in the British Isles. I mean, the stone circle building tradition in the British Isles started about 3000 BC, 5,000 years ago, 500 years before the Great Pyramids were built. Mm-hmm. They were built all over the British Isles. A lot of them were very small. Stonehenge is one of the largest, certainly one of the most impressive. It is actually the only stone circle in the British Isles to actually have those arch stones all the way around the outside of the circle, called lintel stones. Very often in TV shows and Hollywood movies, you see ancient people of Britain or modern people finding a stone circle with those arches on them. The only stone circle to actually have them is Stonehenge. So that's kind of, the other ones are less impressive to look at, which is why Stonehenge is so important, so famous and so well visited. Mm-hmm. But there was no written records at that time. And in fact, there wasn't any written records in this country until 3,000 years later, when the Romans first turned up 2,000 years ago. And it was the Romans and some Greek people that had come to Britain just before that as explorers, from where we get the very first written records about Stonehenge. Mm. Merlin isn't said to have existed until about 500 years after the Romans came. In fact, the Romans were here from around the mid-1st century AD until 410 AD, when they left. The Roman army left because it had to go and defend Rome against an invasion from the east. Merlin is supposed to have lived shortly after that. And the first time I think the Stonehenge thing was mentioned in association with Merlin has to have been after that. The surviving references may not be until the Middle Ages. So obviously very long after the stones were built. And Merlin himself, and I think he probably existed, but that's another story altogether, that if he did, and I think he didn't exist until 3,500 years after the stones were built.
So what led you towards the belief that the stone circles had anything to do with wellness?
Oh, to the healing properties. Mm-hmm. The interesting thing is that nobody knows quite what the stone circles were used for. I mean, there are around about 1,000, between somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200 stone circles still survive in various states of preservation throughout Great Britain and Ireland. Mm-hmm. And they were built from around about 300 3000 BC, right the way through until the Romans arrived. The main period they were built was for the first 1,000 years of that, but they were still being used by migrants who came to Britain over the centuries for some reason, even though they had different religious beliefs. We know this from the way they were buried. So many different cultures that lived in the British Isles between 3000 BC and the time the Romans turned up 3,000 years later, approximately halfway through the 1st century AD, say around about the time that Jesus is said to have lived. That's when the Romans started coming here. Mm-hmm. So during all that time, these stone circles were used. There were some big ones like Stonehenge, but most of them were quite a bit smaller. But there must have been originally, for that many to still survive, there must have been originally thousands of these stone circles across the British Isles. You know, a lot of them have been eradicated by farming, cities being built, infrastructure, that sort of thing. So they must have been very important. A lot of people have thought they were, well, like religious structures, like, you know, the cathedrals and churches of the Middle Ages, or the temples of Egypt. But the interesting thing is that during that 3,000-year period that they were being used and still erected, and again, we know this because archaeologists have found datable samples of animal bones that were underneath the stone circles and so on, as I mentioned before, to be able to date them. Also, you can date pottery that's found there by using a process called thermoluminescence, but I won't bother explaining what that is, but pottery can be dated scientifically. And during all that period, there wasn't just one culture. There were the original people here, known as the late Neolithic people in Britain, who built the first stone circles. Then a few hundred years after they did that, another people came to Britain known as the Beaker people. They arrived from Holland. They came to Britain. They still the reason they're called the Beaker people, we no idea what they call themselves, is because they buried their dead in graves with a small pottery vessel or beaker, hence Beaker people. That was their telltale sign of burial. The earlier people, the Neolithic, buried their dead just in simple graves without grave goods and put a mound over the top. They didn't have the beakers with them. So we know that these Beaker people tended to have a different type of burial. Now, usually the way people are buried denotes that they have a different religious belief to somebody else who buries their dead in a different way. And there were a number of other migrants to Britain about another 500 years after the Beaker people turned up. The so-called Urnfield culture turned up. They came originally from Austria. Austria. They cremated their dead, put the ashes in an urn and buried them in the ground, in fields, hence why they're called the Urnfield culture. So that they buried their dead in a different way, whereas the Beaker people were still there, burying their dead the same way they did, with beakers, and the original lot burying them with nothing. And there was quite a few of these different migrants who came to Britain over this 3,000-year period. The evidence suggests that they buried their dead the same way as they had back where they came from on mainland Europe. So they still held their own religious beliefs, yet they all used the stone circles. We know this because we can find their remains of their distinctive type of pottery and so forth in and around the stone circles. They lived harmoniously with the Britons for much of this time. We know this because no defences were originally built around settlements, and there are no bodies found, skeletons that have got the kind of wounds you'd expect to find in mass battles. So you've got different religious groups, different ethnic groups still using the stone circles, which didn't, to me, imply that it was built for some religious reason. If anything, it must have had some practical function. I mean, if today lots of different people were living in the same country, they might have different kinds of churches and temples, mosques or whatever, but they're all going to be using the same power stations. And they're going to be using the same sewage outlets, you know? In other words, practical things. So this is what made me start thinking that the stone circles may have a practical application.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I think a lot of people always think that it has something to do with religion. I've got a chat room. Well, I've got 2 chat room questions, so let me get those. Tabby wants to know, do you agree that the pits found near Durrington were used to funnel people towards rituals at Stonehenge?
Durrington walls, yes, that is the human settlement, the largest human settlement near Stonehenge. It may be the largest human settlement in the whole of the British Isles that had over 5,000 people living in it. which was, it's about 2 miles from Stonehenge. I mean, at that time, having over 5,000 people living in one place was a massive amount of people, when the whole population of the British Isles was probably only about 250,000. I mean, having over 5,000, maybe as many as 10,000 people living in one place was a major city. So it seems that Stonehenge, because I say there's lots of stone circles all over the country, and then you get, let's say, a tribal area that lived in a particularly large settlement, like Durrington Walls, Durrington, and that group of people would use a stone circle for something, whatever it is. We'll come on to that in a bit. And the stone circle was built with other monuments in the area, which I'll talk about later, but they were the big stone circles, of which there were dozens throughout the country, known as megalithic complexes. Stonehenge wasn't the biggest. There's one north of Stonehenge called Avebury, but about 17 miles north of Stonehenge, which was massive. I mean, if Stonehenge is 100 feet across, then Avebury is 1,000 feet across. I mean, it's much bigger. Not so elaborate. It hasn't got all these stones piled on top of each other, but it's much bigger. The stones are huge. Now, these megalithic complexes served the larger communities, such as Durrington Walls, the one north of Stonehenge. Avebury served another local community, the smaller community. So let's say you've got very big stone circles like Stonehenge and Avebury, built like there would have been, say, cathedrals in the Middle Ages for a city, and then you've got parish churches built for a smaller community. The larger number of stone circles were for smaller communities. Now, Durrington seems to have been the largest prehistoric settlement in the whole of the British Isles. It was huge. And it seems that there was a processional way joining Stonehenge to that, it was like 2 miles away, of posts put in the ground that people would go down this processional way with these posts in the ground either side of it. What they were for, who knows? Were they decorated? Were the garlands of flowers or something put between the posts? Who knows? But the answer to the question is yes.
Yeah. So who were the Wisdomkeepers?
Right. This is where we come on to what the Stone Circle was all about.
Yes.
I mean, my book, Wisdomkeepers of Stonehenge, I didn't come up with that title, by the way. The publisher did. I think I was originally going to call it something much more complicated. But anyway, I liked the title. Who were the people who built Stonehenge? What was it built for? Well, I talked about all these different graves and tombs that have been found for different cultures. One type of grave or tomb that was built throughout the whole megalithic period, i.e. the period when these monuments were built. The word megalith, incidentally, comes from Greek words meaning large stone. So you've got the megalithic culture, the people who built these stone circles, which are unique to the British Isles. I mean, other people erected stones, but not like the stone circles we find in Britain or the British Isles. And a megalith is the name of a large standing stone, or a monolith is another name if they're standing alone. Why were these megalithic stone circles built? Well, if it was for some practical purpose, then maybe tombs that are found next to them might give us some hint, at least as to who was using them. Now, other tombs were built all over the place. There was a special kind of tomb called a box tomb that is basically, on average, about 15 feet long, 6 feet wide, 6 feet high, which is like a long oblong box made from stones, not big, thick standing stones, but cut stones placed in a kind of oblong box formation about 4 to 5 feet high and divided down the middle by another stone slab. So you've got these big stone slabs making this kind of oblong box thing, about 15 feet long and 5 or 6 feet wide, with another stone in the middle dividing it into two chambers. There was capstones put over the top to seal it, and there was an entrance at one end with another stone placed over that. Then the whole thing was covered with earth and, to some degree, broken bits of rock and rubble to form a mound over which grass eventually grew. Now, these box tombs are they're unique in two ways. One, they're found throughout the whole of the megalithic period, regardless of which particular culture seemed to be most prominent and how their graves were, like Urnfield graves and Beaker graves and so on. These box tombs remain the same throughout this whole 3,000-year period. And they were invariably built right next to, and sometimes even within, stone circles. So they seem to have been reserved for some particular group of people who were associated with the stone circles, the custodians, the priesthood, the whatever you want to call them, the people that use the stone circles. And what's interesting about grave goods, things that are put in graves with people, is in some cultures, whatever's buried with them, if they use grave goods, is something they used in life. Now, the Beaker people just used some kind of sacred pot or beaker, but these people who were buried in these box tombs tended to have the things buried with them that they'd have used in life, trinkets, swords. Well, they didn't have swords back then, but whatever. Mm-hmm. But what's fascinating is most of them contain pottery that scientific analysis has shown held pharmaceutical herbal medicines. In other words, these people seem to have been herbalists, and they were healers, and they had some pretty amazing potions that they made based by the scientific finds of what was in the pottery that was found in the tombs. And some of these concoctions, if you like, were made from plants that you had to literally harvest them at a very specific time of the year for them to work. And it may be that the stone circles were used as some kind of astronomical calculator or calendar in order to tell them when exactly to make these medicinal substances.
A prehistoric farmer's almanac, right?
Precisely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And because, in our time, like we think of Lourdes as a place where medical miracles occurred because of the Roman Catholic Church. They recognize it as a holy place because of Bernadette, who saw the vision of the Blessed Mother in the cave. But that's way different than those who came to Stonehenge, and they came from all over Europe because, even if those patients were looking for miracles to be cured, there was no religious aspect to it, was there?
No, I'll explain in a bit just exactly how it worked, how these medicinal substances were made, and some of their advances, the Romans write about them, and they tell us that their advance in medicine was far more than Roman times. Some of it was far more than what we have today. So no wonder they found skeletons of people around there that came from all over Europe to be cured at Stonehenge. Not by magic, not by mystery, not by faith, but by medicine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the thing, that it makes so much sense. You could think of 1,000 different reasons why Stonehenge was made and who was there and everything. But I think that theory that it was a medicinal wellness clinic, I guess, maybe that makes more sense than much of the other things that we kind of surmise might have been.
Well, what I find interesting is my book came out a year or two ago, and I put this theory out there, and obviously it got publicity, but not within the scientific community, until an archaeologist in the last few weeks that's been working on Stonehenge has said pretty much exactly the same thing, and everyone says, "Oh, that's amazing." And I said, "Hold on, I said this 2 years ago."
Yeah, isn't that the way? We're just about ready to take a break. So why don't we do that, and then we'll come back, and everybody stay put. Don't wander off, because we'll be back in just 2 minutes.
Stirring the Cauldron will be right back, so don't go away.
If you end up with web feet,
Remember, you've been warned. Missed an episode of Stirring the Cauldron? Then be sure to check out marlabrooks.com and check out the archive. And while you're there, check out Marla's weekly Witches Oracle card reading. Explore the site to find many great resources, such as information on tarot, oracle readings, metaphysical consultations, and links to all of Marla's books. That's marlabrooks.com.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for listening in to Stirring the Cauldron. I just wanted to give you a quick heads up if you don't already know about the free weekly Witches Oracle deck readings that I post on my website every Monday. Now let me answer the age-old question before you ask it, which is, well, how do I know it's for me? And the answer is pretty simple. If you weren't meant to see it, you wouldn't know it was there. So if you're curious about what the week has in store for you, pop on over to marlabrooks.com every Monday and scroll down on the homepage, and there it will be. If you like tonight's episode of Stirring the Cauldron and the archive podcast as well, take a look at the show's YouTube channel and check out the dozens of shows that are there just waiting to be heard. New shows are added each week, and while you're there, why not subscribe? It's free. And if you click on that tiny little bell icon at the top of the page, you'll be notified when new shows are available. Just go to youtube.com and then type in Stirring the Cauldron Para X, and the link will appear. Just like magic.
Welcome back to Stirring the Cauldron. Once again, here's your host, Marla Brooks.
My guest tonight is Graham Phillips, and we're talking about his book, Wisdomkeepers of Stonehenge. Now, Graham, holistic medicine is probably one of the oldest ways of treating illnesses that goes back probably to cavemen, even though they didn't know what they were doing. They figured it out. I guess so. Stonehenge, like you said, dates back so far. Did the Stonehenge Wisdom Keepers practice? They do practice an oral tradition because, as you said, there wasn't any writing. So is there some place that we got disjointed and everything? Because you said in the book they found cures for things that we don't have cures for now, like cancer, for example. Why haven't all those things? I mean, if somebody sat down and wrote it finally, when it came down in time, or was all that knowledge lost?
Unfortunately, it was pretty much lost. What happened was that in the middle of the 1st century AD, 2,000 years ago, the Romans invaded Britain. Now, it's from the Romans that we get most of our information about what the people of Britain were doing. Now, by the time the Romans arrived, the people in Britain were known as the Celts. They were like the last of these migrants to come to Britain. They arrived in around about 700 AD. They were very different from the earlier cultures like the Beaker people and the Urnfield culture, in as much as they used iron implements. So you're talking about a much different kind of age when they've got iron swords, their farming techniques are using much more sophisticated implements and so forth. The climate had changed in Britain by this time. It was very much colder, therefore resources were more scarce. The tribal areas did become more warring between them. There was fortifications built and so on. But even so, some of the stone circles are still used, some of them repaired or even new ones built. And these box tombs containing whoever these people were that seemed to use stone circles continued to be built unabated. So even these more warlike Celts that arrived the Iron Age Celts that arrived in Britain were still at least respecting whatever the stone circles were used for. Perhaps, as I'd suggested, these as calculators to work out when exactly to plant, tend to, and harvest certain medicinal plants, as well as perhaps ordinary crops. And so they were still venerating these people. Now, the Romans tell us who was buried in these tombs, and they say it was somewhat a group of people called the Druids. Now, I think many people are familiar with the term. Modern Druids tend to dress up in white robes and meet at Stonehenge at the midsummer solstice in the morning to watch the sun come up. These people were only founded, really, in the last century. There were people trying to recreate what they thought Druids did. The Druids themselves died out shortly after the Romans came, because the Romans wanted to wipe them out, because they said that they were a group of people, like a sort of priesthood, that kept the separate Celtic tribes of Britain united. They seemed to have influence over and above all of them. And the Romans didn't like the Celtic tribes of Britain to be united because they couldn't control them. So they ordered, or the Emperor Nero, in the second half of the 1st century AD, ordered that the Roman soldiers wipe out these Druids, and they pretty much did. And so, but luckily, before that happened, we find out what these Druids were actually up to. Now, they seem to have been their ancestors, if you like, or those that went before them, where the same people had been using these stone circles for years. We don't know what they were called hundreds of years before, but as I say, the Romans were calling them the Druids. So those are one and the same people as I've been referring to as Wisdomkeepers of Stonehenge, because they weren't just priests. They were not only just healers, but from what the Romans say, they basically were the knowledge or the storehouses of information for a people before the Romans turned up who had no form of writing to record the methods of how they did all this stuff with herbs, how they about agriculture, about weapon making, about tool making, and everything else that's normally written down. And how did they do this? Well, Julius Caesar tells us about the Druids. I mean, some of the Druids were also found in northern France by this point. And Julius Caesar writes about them there and says that, first of all, to become a Druid, you had to go through like 20 years of training. People were chosen as children. They were chosen as children and usually picked because they had very good memories, eidetic memories, as might be called today, photographic memories. They had very good memories, and then they were put through a lot of training to learn how to actually memorize things much more easily. Some people may have seen mentalists on stage who can remember vast amounts of information, they're shown 20 packs of cards, turned over at random, and they can remember what each card number was. There are techniques for doing that, about how you visualize things in your mind, how you compartmentalize your mind. And it takes training. There are also other techniques that seem to have been used that the Roman writers tell us about that we would today probably call hypnosis. So they were trained to memorize stuff. So it seems that the group of people who were buried in these tombs next to the stone circles, who used the stone circles, had phenomenal memories. And there was like groups of them that most people lived a couple of miles away from stone circles, like we were just talking about Durrington near Stonehenge. But the only people that tended to live in small groups of clusters of huts, if you like, near the stone circles were these Druids, these wisdom keepers. And they were basically the libraries of the local community. They were the libraries of megalithic society. They were the ones who were holding the the history and the technology, if you want to call it that, and healing techniques and everything else in their minds, and then they would pass it on to the next generation. So they were essential for the pre-Roman culture in Britain. So this is how they seem to have known or remembered and passed on how to use these astonishing medicinal these herbal medicinal substances, the cures that they had.
And then probably because they've done archaeological digs and everything, I would think that they would take some of the pottery and all that and see what kind of potions, what kind of mixtures were in there, and then maybe figured out that that's some of the things that we might use now for our certain maladies and stuff.
Yes, some of these substances we use. They're taken from plants, which the substances used in the first kind of aspirin, for example, painkillers. There are things that are used now. Some of the plants that we used for deworming. Now that's now the same plants are used to make deworming medicines for pets. Then a lot of humans got intestinal worms, which were pretty horrible, and these things could deworm them. They've got medicine. I mean, perhaps one of the most fantastic that they use is mistletoe extracts are found in a lot of these tombs. And one of the Roman writers, a man called Pliny the Elder in the 1st century AD, actually tells us that they used mistletoe and they used it for something that he says cured what the Romans, from what he describes, he says they cured tumors, cancer. Now, what's fascinating is this particular extract from mistletoe is now used in certain forms of chemotherapy. So it wasn't rediscovered till years later. They also use something called the, which is known today as Jimson's weed. It doesn't grow in Britain anymore, or the thorn apple, which can be used as an anaesthetic to put people to sleep, and you can for surgery, particularly the amputation of infected limbs. Now, there wasn't an effective anaesthetic rediscovered until the 19th century in the form of chloroform and ether. And so they were way ahead of their time. Now, the thing about this, let's just take mistletoe. Pliny tells us that they actually used to have to cut the mistletoe at a certain phase of the moon, at a certain time of the year, based on the planets and so forth, based on where the stars were, and so forth. The part of the mistletoe plant that's actually the extract that's used, if it's taken at any time except for a very particular time of the year, at a certain time of night, it's deadly poisonous. It only becomes medicinal if you cut it at a certain time. Why? Well, the reason being is many plants, especially those that are used for medicines, change their chemical properties depending on the time of the year and particular times of their day or night. Why? So that different smells, if you like, can be given off that are detected by pollinating insects that are in the stage where they're flying around. Most of the time, insects spend their time as grubs or caterpillars or maggots, if you like. But pollinating insects, when they get to a certain time, some of them only live for a couple of weeks and they only breed at a certain time. That's when they're pollinating. So the plant wants to make sure that the right kind of chemical odors, if you like, are given off at the right time to attract these insects. So you have to know exactly when to actually cut certain plants and harvest them to get the right kind of substance. And if you don't get it, it's either useless or poisonous, toxic. So the thing is that certain of these plants, like mistletoe, for example, are pollinated by moths, certain types of moths. And they only fly and pollinate when the moon's up and in a certain position. That helps them guide them to where their potential mates are. So they land on plants to get the nectar and to feast, if you like, and then move to another plant and pollinate it. So it's important where the moon is and what time of the year it is and what particular time of the day or night it is, particularly night. A lot of these medicinal substances are pollinated by night pollinating insects. Now, this is where your stone circles come in. The planets tend to the night sky. All the stars are in the same relative position to one another in the sky, and they appear. Obviously, they move across the sky as the Earth rotates. Of course, back then, the people probably thought that the firmament, the sky, was moving, but it doesn't matter. They saw the stars moved across the sky every night. Next night they'd come up, they'd be in the same position relative to each other. But as the year gradually went by, stars would gradually move their positions, not in relation to each other, but in relation to the Earth. Now, you need some kind of grid reference to know when a particularly bright star, let's say Sirius or the belt of Orion or whatever, is in a particular position. And over trial and error, over many years, they're going to know when that particular star is just above that particular stone or just in between those particular stones. That is when we have to harvest the mistletoe, and when the moon's up or whatever. And then another one will be, when that particular star is just about there between or above those particular stones, that's when we have to harvest that particular plant. So this is why it doesn't matter really how many stones you've got. You have to have quite a few, and it doesn't matter necessarily how big they are. It's just that you've got a ring of stones. You could do it with poles, wooden posts, but they would tend to bend and move, in the weather, and as the ground moved and rot away. But stones are more permanent. So that is what it seems that stone circles were used for. Stonehenge is just a particularly elaborate one that allowed some very, very fine timing indeed. So that is the answer, in my humble opinion, as to what Stonehenge was for. If you like, it was a mechanism as part of a healing sanctuary. So Stonehenge in its area was a prehistoric healing sanctuary or hospital.
And you mentioned the stones earlier, that there were two types of stones, and first was, I'm not going to pronounce it right probably, but the sarsen stone, and then the smaller blue stones were the Priscilli stones. And I was doing a little tiny bit of research because I wasn't familiar with them, and those blue stones were supposed to have healing properties, and they're still used today for healing because they seem to give off what they say is some kind of a primordial vibration with an ancient energy. So I was kind of interested.
Well, I'm sure that the ancient people, although over time they had developed and known about how to use herbal medicines, they would, over many centuries, after using them, would come to think of stone circles as being curative in their own right, whether they were or weren't. There are certainly alignments of stones that run across the landscape of the British Isles, very often joining together stone circles. You've got one stone circle and another one some distance away, and there are stones set in the ground between them. Some people have called these ley lines, but whether they actually connected all stone circles together, as some people believe, we don't know, because there's been too much infrastructure created since that time and stones have disappeared. But it certainly seems like some of these circles were joined by alignments of stones, sometimes many miles apart, but you'd follow a line and you'd find another stone standing there, 6-foot stone in the middle of nowhere. Now, these alignments, it has been suggested some years ago by a British author called Tom Graves. He suggested that these alignments were alignments of some kind of energy that ran through the earth that the ancients knew about. They used dowsers to feel this energy, and they placed these stones where these lines of energy were, and stone circles were built where these lines crossed. And he believed that the earth contains some kind of energy to help with crops, to help with healing of people, where people could go, where they crossed and gained spiritual enlightenment. Whether that really did happen or whether they believed it, he said that's why the stones were put there. And why? Well, in China, there still is something called feng shui, which is where buildings are erected in certain places and monuments built to channel some kind of earth energy for this same believed purpose. And he believed that something like that was happening in Britain, in the British Isles, and that in the same way that the Chinese use acupuncture, there's the meridians, the lines of energy throughout the body, and you stick a needle in one place and it causes relief of pain or something to happen elsewhere in the body. He actually believed that the stones that were placed into these alignments of earth energy were like the needles put into the body in acupuncture. In other words, it was an acupuncture of the earth. He actually called his book Needles of Stone. Oh. So who knows?
Yeah. I mean, when you dig a little, you get so much out of it, I would not have ever thought that Stonehenge was anything but some place, as you said, where people gather at solstice, and it's kind of a magical place. And I thought, well, maybe it was astrology had something to do with it, but never put two and two together where astronomy and medicine can do so nicely, so hand in hand.
Indeed. I mean, probably the most fascinating thing about this megalithic civilization is that once people thought that Stonehenge is in the south of England. Avebury Stone Circle, which, as I say, is much bigger, is in the south of England. That's where the bigger stone circles tended to be. And people thought, well, that's where it started, and it gradually moved north until there was stone circles and standing stones all over Scotland, and then across the sea in Ireland and in Wales and the west of the British Isles, that came later. Because in Brittany, in northwest France, there is a culture that's also known as megalithic because they erected large stones. But it's nothing like the British megalithic culture. They erected standing stones and they erected them in lines. A lot of countries, a lot of cultures throughout the world did in ancient times. But there's nothing like the kind of stone circles and other monuments like that were built by the people of the British Isles that are in that part of France or anywhere else in Europe or even in Scandinavia. There's nothing like it. So it's unique to the British Isles, the megalithic culture of stone circle building. And also these box tombs with these curative plants in them, unique to the British Isles, at least originally. It may have spread elsewhere afterwards. But people once thought it started in the south and then moved north. But since radiocarbon dating and also thermoluminescent pottery dating has been invented in recent years, they can date stone circles. They know the oldest ones are in the north. So it started in the north and then came south. In fact, the oldest stone circle in the whole British Isles is on the Orkney Isles, which are about, 20 miles north of the northern point of Scotland, the top of the British Isles. That's where the oldest stone circles are. Something called the Stones of Stonehenge is 3,100 BC. That's over 5,000 years old. And it seems to have started there. Not only were these box tombs erected at that time and they found inside the tombs that are there, the same kind of substances that they'd been using as cures throughout the rest of the country. So you've got number of very fascinating things. Firstly, the ability to be able to build these stone circles, shape the stones and move them, also to build the kind of advanced tombs that there are up there, would have taken many years and generations to perfect. Certainly the kind of medicinal substances that are found in the tombs would have taken generations to perfect, because people say, oh, let's try a bit of that. Dead. Oh, let's try a bit of that. Oh, no, dead. It should have taken centuries to develop that level of sophisticated pharmaceutical knowledge. And the kind of pottery they use, something called grooved-ware pottery, which had flat bottoms, could only be made with sophisticated kilns, which were not in existence in the British Isles before 3000 BC. But this civilization, if you like, this culture, the megalithic culture that had all this knowledge, seemed to spring into existence out of nowhere just before 3000 BC. So, as there is no evidence of this culture gradually developing on the Orkney Isles or anywhere else, it must have come from someplace else. But there's no evidence that it developed in Scandinavia or anywhere in northwest Europe or even in Iceland. Where did it come from? Did somebody suddenly think it up overnight? The mystery is, where did the megalithic civilization come from? How did they gain this medicinal knowledge?
Yeah, and that's probably the question that can't be answered. It could be theorized, but I don't know that anybody could just say, well, this is it, and, walk away.
Well, that's actually what my next book's all about.
Do tell. Come on, spill it.
I can't really, because it would give it away, but it's a lost civilization.
Oh, okay.
I'm being told by the publishers, you mentioned this, and you're in serious trouble.
Well, okay.
But I'll come on to your show. The book's finished now. It's off to the publishers. It shall be coming out shortly, and I'll come on your show and tell everybody.
That sounds good. I will keep my ears and eyes open for that. We could talk about this for another hour or two, maybe, because the book it really is interesting, and not only that, there's some gorgeous pictures of megaliths and stones and colored, nice, beautiful pictures in there too. So, if you don't feel like reading and you just want to get an eye full of happiness, you can look at this too. So, I think this is a book that if people like mysteries, if people like all that stuff, it's a good book to read, because it just kind of makes you look at Stonehenge as with a different attitude. It's just something that came out that it's like, oh wow, that really makes sense. But in the meantime, before we leave, I think other than the new books, if you're up to anything else lately, let us know. And also, please give out your website so people can find out about all your books and all your shenanigans and good stuff.
Okay, well, my website is grahamphillips.net. I couldn't get .com because somebody else has got it, although they never use it. grahamphillips.net. And when you go there, you'll see the links at the top of there. All my books are there, pictures of them on the first page you get to. You click on any of those pictures, and there's a good few pages of information about my books, plus photographs and illustrations and so forth. And also the link there to my Facebook and everything else, my YouTube channel and whatnot. So, grahamphillips.net.
Yes, and I spent a lot of time over there the other day, just looking and being really happy. So, yes, as soon as you know that book is coming out, please let me know. I think your publisher will probably send me one. They know that I like having you on the show, but we'll just, have a reminder and we'll set up a date. And so thank you for staying up or getting up again to do the show tonight.
Oh, I'll just go back to sleep now for the second half of the night.
There you go. And I do appreciate your efforts in doing that. And so thank you. And thank you, everybody for listening in tonight. And until next time, everyone, blessed be, and merry meet again. Good night.
This has been another edition of Stirring the Cauldron with Marla Brooks.
Be sure to tune in next week at the same time for another great guest and more fun. Any rebroadcast or other use of this program without permission is strictly prohibited. Copyright 2009.
You have been listening to the Para X Radio Network.